Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for another Ask the Experts virtual workshop presented by Children and Screens. I am Dr. Pamela Hurst Della Pietra, the organization's president and founder, and I am your host today. For those of you who've joined us for the first time, Children and Screens is one of the nation's leading nonprofits supporting and advancing evidence-based scientific research on technologies. Let me just make sure everything's working. Okay, anyway, Children's Screens is one of the nation's leading nonprofits supporting and advancing evidence-based scientific research on technology's impacts on child health and well-being, convening interdisciplinary clinicians, researchers, educators, public health experts, and others, and educating the public about the impacts of technology on children's health, well-being, and development. During the pandemic, Children and Screens is funding research projects to study how screens are benefiting families and friends around the world through connectivity and other ways, and also how increased digital device use may be influencing children and teens' development adversely during and after the crisis. This summer is difficult in an increasing number of ways, from shuttered camps to riots on the streets, all while trying to parent, sticking to health protocols, maintaining social distance, and working from home. What about screens? Are you struggling with limiting your own device use, much less your child's? Do you have a plan yet for how your children will fill their days this summer? We hope that the conversation today about managing summer on and off screen will help families discuss what's going on and what's working, what's not, and we hope to give you some ideas to strengthen family connections and aid healthy development for your children and tweens. I would like to extend a big thank you in advance to our standing panel of experts for sharing their expertise today. Our panelists have reviewed the questions you submitted and will answer as many as they can. If you have additional questions during the workshop, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to answer as many of them as possible. We're recording today's workshop and hope to upload a video onto YouTube in the coming days. You'll receive a link to our YouTube channel tomorrow, where you'll find videos from our past webinars and our YouTube channel. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. David Hill. Dr. Hill is renowned for his expertise in child development and serves patients and their families as a pediatrician in Goldsboro, North Carolina. He also holds an adjunct professorship at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine. We're delighted to have Dr. Hill with us today. Welcome, David.
Thank you so much, Pamela. I'm honored to be here, and I want to welcome all of our participants here today. I think we'll get a few more as we go. I have the tremendous honor to kick us off today by introducing Dr. Jessica Taylor Piotrowski. She is an associate professor in the Amsterdam School of Communication Research at the University of Amsterdam. She is the director at the Center for Research on Children, Adolescents, and the Media, the program group leader for youth and media entertainment at ASCOR, and recently completed a 4-year term as the chair of the Children, Adolescents, and Media Division of the International Communication Association. Dr. Piotrowski's research investigates how youth process and comprehend media content, with specific attention to the potential benefits of media. She's particularly focused on understanding how young users process media content cognitively, effectively, and physiologically, and the role of individual differences, dispositional, developmental, and social, in the selection and processing of media content. She's the co-author of the book Plugged In: How Media Attract and Affect Youth from Yale University Press, 2017, and regularly publishes in communication, psychology, and educational journals. Dr. Piotrowski, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon in Amsterdam.
Thank you so much, David, for that warm welcome, and thanks to Pam, as always, for organizing, I think, these very brilliant workshops. As a very detailed introduction, I think I really appreciate all that was said there, but I think what's probably most important is that In my role as the director of the center, I'm really working and thinking about how parents and children are really engaging with media on an everyday basis. And right now, really thinking about what this means in times of Corona. Today, what I thought I would do is start the conversation by giving us an overview of the types of kids we're talking about. So thinking about what we mean when we think about the phrase middle childhood. I then want to get a little bit into what their media preferences are and why they prefer this, and then think through some ideas for the summer months. I'm going to share some slides today that we can make available to you afterwards just to increase the accessibility of this information. But of course, if your phone is down and you're just listening, that works just as well. So let me just get us started here. Okay, so today, as I mentioned, I'm going to be discussing middle childhood. And it's interesting because when I was invited to speak today, one of my first questions to Pam and others was, how do you define middle childhood? And I think that's such an interesting question because what we find is that there's a range of definitions. Generally, we're thinking about kids between about 6 to 12 years old. So if you're a parent or caregiver in this range, a lot of this will be absolutely familiar to your own experiences today, I hope. What's interesting as a scholar is that I've been studying this for over a decade. And what I find is that this group seems to be forgotten sometimes by scholars. We spend a lot of time thinking of our little guys, and we spend a lot of time talking about teens, but somewhere in between, I often feel like this group, we're suffering with middle childhood syndrome. We keep forgetting them. And yet there's such interesting things happening in this period that play such a big role in how they consume media content, their daily lives, and actually what might work and not work this summer for them. So let's talk about a few things. One key thing I think to be aware of is that cognitively, they are changing in ways that we are probably more unaware of. We see, for example, that their attentional skills suddenly begin to increase. And this is something where you notice as a parent over time, but it doesn't happen overnight, right? During this period, we see that they can attend to more content. They start to recall more information because they're processing content more deeply. Those of you with children in this age group might see that their spatial skills are improving or their mathematical skills. They begin to read lengthier texts. Their reading fluency is improving and their comprehension. And something we call theory of mind, this idea of understanding that people think differently than one another, for example, begins to become much more detailed. So suddenly their cognitive skills are really improving dramatically. It's almost a superpower for them, or they can use this newfound skill in ways they never could before. At the same time, what we also see is that their emotional development is changing because they can start to understand others, right? So suddenly they begin to think, oh, I feel differently than you for different reasons. They can make that understanding. What starts to happen is peers become much more important. Now, those of you with parents or children in this age range, which I assume many of you are, you may be seeing a transition where peers become more important and they start to desire a bit more autonomy. They're often sort of deciding which part is their parents' roles and which part is for their peers. And you start to see this tension as this transition is happening. And what's interesting, and in the book that was mentioned by David, and a lot of my scholarship, what I found is that these cognitive changes, so the way that they're thinking more and understanding more deeply, combined with their emotional changes, being able to understand others, desiring a deeper connection for peers, really leads to unique changes in their media preferences and how they use media. So for example, what we see is that for this group, and I'm curious, actually, maybe during the Q&A, we'll hear about this, how much this is similar for what you find. But generally what we see is that children start to like more fast-paced content. They start to prefer this faster, more information, give me more. Academically, we use a term called decentration. I like to think of this as the little scientist. They can think more and suddenly they kind of want to examine everything. You might find that kids begin to want to collect more. Whether it's baseball cards, classic baseball cards, or Pokemon, or whatever the newest toy is, if they can collect them all and begin to examine them. They start to show more interest in reality. They still like fantasy, but that fantasy elements, particularly when it has a realistic storyline, is really interesting. So here, think of something like Harry Potter. And while when they were little, their favorite characters and favorite preferences often were driven solely by how they looked, or maybe their gender. Now they begin to be much more interested also in psychological similarities, things that sort of share some idea of who they are. And then they like to remind us that anything is cool is for the win. That's what they're really looking for these times. What is cool, I'll never know, but they sure do. Interestingly enough, when we try to understand what these kids are doing, their media habits, of course, are very diverse, just as kids are diverse. But we see, and you may be experiencing this yourself, an interest in online videos. So, for example, YouTube Spaces, really watching lots of different videos from influencers, lots of different hobbies and crafts. They're really kind of examining and watching videos. And they really enjoy digital games. We see lots of uptick at games at this age. And what's interesting is that we don't see as much social media yet. Now, it's not that it's not there. For most, if they're using social media spaces, it's often for the gaming elements right now. They might connect with peers because peers are really interesting to them, but they're not yet using it the way we might see teens using it, which is often more for expression. Of course, there's a lot of differences in this space, and I want to be careful to generalize here. But overall, we see the patterns are that it's a little less social media with this group. Except, and the except is that with times of Corona and children being forced to engage in social distancing, as all of us are, we do see some interest in finding ways and platforms to allow young kids to connect with their friends in ways maybe they hadn't before, simply in order to maintain these peer relationships. So we do see this very interesting bump happening right now. Now, normally when I talk about this, usually I'll get a question about how much are they using. And we can talk about this in the Q&A afterwards, and I would really be happy to try to dig into this more. But I'm hesitant to give direct estimates. And the reason I say that is because there's such imperfect measurement out there. I'm not even sure I could tell you how much media I used yesterday, and I'm a media scholar. It's so hard to identify what we mean by use, what we mean by screen time, how we consider multitasking, how we really create a number that seems reliable. But in general, the patterns show that this group does certainly use more media for leisure. In general, we see, for example, in the United States samples, that children from lower income families do tend to use a bit more. And for all of us, adults and children, naturally these estimates are higher during the COVID-19 pandemic, because all of our work and leisure for many of us is being relegated more to the digital space, and certainly for many young kids also for school. So what are we doing with all this? How do we think about this whole changing space, and what should we be thinking moving forward? Well, I want to be careful, because one of the things I get a lot of questions about right now, and I imagine, and I notice in the questions that were submitted and from many of you, is how much. With all of this changing, with many schools, not all, but many schools providing education over digital education, with social distancing measures requiring teams to be apart from one another, with perhaps this summer camps and other activities being canceled, and parents, for those who do work at home or being able to work at home, trying to balance this with their children, there's a lot of questions about how much, what's going to be okay. I am not a fan of giving estimates, and other panelists may offer different answers today, but for myself, I tend to feel that quality over quantity works better these days. I always stick by quotes by Sherry Turkle and others where she suggests that media is neither good nor bad, but it is powerful. It does have effects, this we know, but these effects are so defined by the contours of who the child is. They're so defined by the contours of the context of what's happening in that environment and that content that they're engaging in, that any estimate that I would give you feels like it's losing that nuance. And I think that ultimately parents and caregivers are best apt at identifying the content that meets their own value systems and that feels good to them. So rather than giving you a number per se, which I know is a helpful heuristic, I'd rather say thinking about quality, which I realize is easier said than done. And I'd be happy to engage in conversations about what this might mean. Now, having said all that, we come to this summer of 2020 and we come to our Corona summer. What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to handle this? How are you as parents and caregivers supposed to handle a situation where this is truly unprecedented and we're not sure what to do, and there's really no rule book on what to do? Well, I have a couple points of advice that I want to raise that'd be really welcome additional conversation on. The first has to do with something very unique to this pandemic, and that is handling news and fear. Oftentimes I talk with parents and they ask me, you know, my child's not watching the news, but I'm sure she probably hears it, or I'm sure he might hear it. Should I be worried? Should I engage with it? The answer is yes. I do believe you should. I think you should be very well aware and very much tuned into what your child's asking. Even if they're not watching it directly, they are hearing it. They are seeing it. They are watching you respond to it. And the very real truth is that young kids can experience fear from this. We have a very interesting political climate right now that is leading to lots of very hotly debated topics and conversations. This can lead to fear. We have the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is scary to many children, as it rightfully should be, frankly, for adults too. And we have something like the Black Lives Matter movement happening right now in our very communities. And this is raising such important and valuable conversations, but also naturally fear, right? This is so much coming in for all of us, kids too. So what should you do? In my research and research of my colleagues, what we found is that answer the questions that your kids have, but answer them honestly and simply. You don't have to give everything you know. You really want to tailor it to what you believe your child can handle, but you can answer these questions. If your child seems particularly anxious, for example, consider ways that you might try to tackle this actively. So, for example, a few months ago here in the Netherlands, we were talking to a lot of parents, and their children were very, very concerned that they were going to get sick. And the question was, well, what do we do? What can we actively do? And so parents started choosing a song every day that they would sing with their children when they washed their hands. It was sort of a way to sort of actively tackle something very overwhelming for them. I would also say you want to be aware of your own responses. Sometimes it's so easy for us as adults to have these very heated responses because the world is scaring us too in many ways. Our kids see that, right? Children see this and that reflects in them. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't feel that way. It just means you should be aware that kids will see this as well. If your children are a bit older and looking up information, which many of them are, particularly if they own their own smartphone, which happens a lot during this period of time for certain children, for certain families, try to see if you can help them find information from official channels. There's so much misinformation these days that trying to help them find the trusted sources that you and your family value would be a really important step. There's no shame in taking a media timeout. I am a media scholar. I see the beautiful benefits of media all the time for young kids, and I see it playing a very powerful opportunity for the lives of many young kids. But it doesn't mean that I don't believe in media timeouts. Sometimes we all need a break, and maybe your media break is something you build in daily. And I also always go back to Mr. Rogers, probably one of my favorite children's media icons of all time, when he said, find the helpers. In times of stress, in times of panic, in times of challenge, find the helpers. There's always someone. That's sort of this idea. And I think there's so many different ways that you can find the helpers. You can find the people and the spaces and the examples in your community that show how people are trying and working and committed just by social distancing. You are helping in this pandemic, right? So can you allay some fears by showing some of the positive side, showing things that what's being done? At the same time as dealing with all of this, I also want you to take a guilt-free breath. I can't tell you how many interviews I've done over the past 2 weeks where parents have said, I think this summer is going to have more media and I feel so bad about it. It's okay, right? It's okay. I think we have to be a little bit gentle with ourselves right now and recognize that you are not just parenting, you're parenting during a pandemic, right? This is a totally new space and it's okay. Take a guilt-free breath. When you can, quality over quantity, I would definitely recommend. If social distancing continues in your community, every community is certainly different with when they're enacting different measures right now. The value of digital time with family and friends is absolutely okay. So if they're connecting with their peers or their grandparents, for example, this is a really rich opportunity for connection. To help yourself, especially as you're trying to think about what your summer might look like, if you can put together a routine that is manageable for your family. There is no perfect routine, but the one that feels doable for your family, that routine can be really helpful for you and your child. And this can include a media routine. You can download online, for example, and I'm sure we can also provide lots of information to you on, for example, family media agreements, where you and your child can sit down together and sort of say, what are we going to do each week? What's going to be our goals? How are we going to do that? Give your kids some autonomy, some voice in this. At this age, they're really craving it as well. And when possible, and when in your community safe and doable, offline activities or sort of a hybrid, online, offline can be great. Again, I want to be realistic here about what is possible, right? When you're working, or if your community is not particularly safe for outdoor play, or if you're managing multiple children at the same time, do what feels best for you as a parent and what's manageable. But some things I've seen that work really well and have a lot of flexibility in budget and time, and the kids enjoy a lot of different ages, include things like setting up a backyard obstacle course, right? Whatever you can find at home, whatever you can create, that can be a fun afternoon activity that your kids can really get involved in. Arts and crafts activities are brilliant, and YouTube Kids, which is different than YouTube, but YouTube Kids specifically has a great space with lots of very low-cost examples. Pretzel sticks, peanut butter, and hanging them on a string for a bird feeder works incredibly quick and fast and fun. If your children have a smartphone, for example, the classic photo of a day project where every day they take a picture and they sort of at the end of the summer try to look at their summer overall can be a great activity for them. Cooking together. This is an age where the children really enjoy the science behind cooking, and they really enjoy sort of creations, and to the level you feel safe on what they can create. Maybe one day if you're working at home, if you have a job that allows you to work at home, maybe your child will make you peanut butter and jelly for lunch. Nature time, I think, is always valuable if that is available and accessible in your community. Fresh air is wonderful for all of us. I will never suggest anything except for reading. I think reading is always going to be on every list I ever have. Public libraries should be open in most communities again, and are also going to be allowing ordering and things like that even more to create accessibility. So that's a great space. And there's a range of really accessible educational apps, and many companies, because of the pandemic, have made these apps free. So if you do have smartphone technology for you and your child, many of these apps are a great way to sort of bolster their summer activity and maybe sort of deal with some of the decreased education that they may have experienced as a result of the pandemic. But at the end of the day, I just want you to take care of you. I want you to take care of your families. I want you to realize that being logged on today and listening to this is already saying so much about the efforts you are placing in trying to figure out what to do. And I wish you the best of luck this summer, and I wish you health, and I hope that you are all well. And I'm really happy to take questions after all this is done, and really looking forward to hearing from my fellow panelists. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was brilliant. I am just piping in here for a second because I had neglected and forgotten to mention that Dr. David Hill is the former chairman of the American Academy of Pediatrics Council on Communications and Media, where he was responsible for developing the Interactive Family Media Use Toolkit and a lot of other guidelines for parents. And hopefully, David, you'll talk a little bit about that more, but you know, your contribution was really immense. So I'm sorry I neglected to say that. So now, David, if you can carry on with Jessica, I'm sorry to interrupt.
You bet, you bet. Thank you so much. Appreciate that, and I look forward to piping up here and there, but I'm just learning a lot today. Speaking of learning, I get the joy of introducing our next speaker. Dr. Dan Shapiro, fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics, like myself, came from East Lansing, Michigan to attend medical school at George Washington University in DC. He did his pediatric residency at Children's Hospital there, and then practiced pediatric and adolescent medicine in Silver Spring, Maryland for 13 years before shifting his focus to developmental and behavioral pediatrics. He now sees children and their families in his home office and also observes children and collaborates with educators at dozens of area schools, or at least will again when they're open. He developed the Journey program and offers this behavior management training group throughout Greater Washington. He is another fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics and a member of the Society for Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics. Dr. Shapiro is married with 4 children and 2 grandchildren, and he enjoys music, reading, and floating down the Potomac in a kayak. Welcome, Dr. Shapiro.
Thanks, David, very much. And thanks to Children and Screens and Pam for inviting me to participate in this wonderful panel. We've all been shut down through the spring, and we're heading into an uncertain summer. Our concerns about social distancing and screen dependence have only increased. We get into screen conflicts with our children, family, and friends. You get flooded with expert and internet advice that can be pretty confusing and overwhelming. And it's important to have a menu of ideas about what you can do. But when parents and children have different opinions about screen time, How do you stay out of power struggles? Well, about screens or anything really, we can just tell children what to do and do the authoritarian my way approach, or we can just cave into whatever they want to do and do the permissive parenting your way approach, or we can talk with them and together come up with solutions that are mutually satisfying. Some parents and some experts react to this collaborative problem-solving model pessimistically. They say some parents just can't do that. But just like math, reading, writing, I'd argue that listening, brainstorming, and compromising are skills that can be successfully taught and learned by children and parents. It just takes time and practice. It all starts with empathy. Here's where we want to stay out of those power struggles. And this is a sincere effort, a genuine effort to understand your child. And the idea here is to really help your child feel understood, validate your child's feelings, teach them the language of emotion, and then you can gain traction for some collaborative problem solving. Some ideas about verbal empathic responses, bringing it to our screen discussion here. I guess you might say, you feel like we're not being fair. It sure is frustrating when we have different rules than other parents about screens. I know how hard it is for you to stop playing when you're right in the middle of a game. It sounds like you're pretty angry. You feel like we should just back off and let you make your own decisions. If you can't have your screens, you feel like there's nothing else to do and you get bored. And this can be a real bummer. This should not be said with sarcasm. It should be genuine, and don't say, but you need to get off, but you need to get outside, get some exercise, etc. As soon as you say but, you are leaving empathy and getting into preaching. Now, if your child looks at you when you're being empathic with words and accuses you of just taking some parenting webinar or being phony about it, or if they just feel like you're putting fuel on their emotional fires and they react back, you can tone it down and go nonverbal. Don't underestimate the power of just coming close, using some softer body language, some softer facial expressions, touching and hugging in a way that your child welcomes. The main thing is to stay 100% present. Just a simple sigh, but mainly listening. And that empathy can be applied in this vignette. So mom might say, time to get off that video game. Timmy says, I'm not done yet. And then mom might escalate. If you don't turn that screen off by the time I count to 5, no screens for a week. Timmy ignores, keeps playing. Mom escalates more. That's it, young man. I'm taking away your iPad. Timmy, I hate you. You're the worst mom in the world. I don't know if this sounds familiar to some of you, but a better way for mom would be, again, time to get off the video. Timmy, I'm not done yet. But instead of escalating, mom softens her tone, says, I know you hate it when I ask you to stop playing. That must be really frustrating for you. And then she pauses and allows for some silence, allows for a void. Timmy keeps playing, but he glances once in mom's direction. This is a bit of acknowledgement, a bit of recognition that mom's being kind, and mom goes on, well, not right now, but let's pick a time to talk later. I bet if we put our heads together, we can come up with a good solution. And she walks away, strategically, deliberately, in the moment, lets it go. But she doesn't let it go entirely. The next day, she teaches Timmy to do these steps where, hey, together, you and I are each going to say what the problem is. We're each going to come up with possible solutions. We're each going to examine each one. We're each going to pick the solution that is mutually acceptable and therefore durable. And then we're going to get back together and see how it works. So there's a temptation when you're saying what the problem is, the first S in steps, to make pessimistic generalizations. Like Timmy might say, you never let me do anything I want. And mom might say, you're going to rot your brain and your body and drive me crazy too. Instead, we want to state problems in specific solvable terms. And I call it the 5 WH. What's the problem? who's it with, where are you having it, when does it tend to happen, why is it a problem for you, and the H is how big is it for you. The 0 is no problem, 10 is impossible, 1 to 3 minor, 4 to 6 moderate, 7 to 9 severe. You can use picture faces, whatever. The idea is to get out of heaven and hell, black and white thinking, recognize there are numbers 1 through 9. It's not all 0 to 10. And this problem statement should be done by both the child and the parent. The parent's issues are on the table, the child's issues are on the table. We're gonna involve anybody who's in that system, that problem system, including a spouse, a partner, an ex, sibs, grandparents, teachers, professionals. Anybody can get sucked into a power struggle if they don't take a step back. So Timmy and Mom will focus on them just to simplify. Both say they get frustrated, even angry with each other when Mom wants to have a family dinner and Timmy wants to keep playing with his video games, and they both rate it as an 8. Then we ask them to think about all possible solutions. This is a brainstorming step. You're not allowed to comment on whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. We're not going to get into a debate here as we go. That'll shut down the brainstorming process. We just, hey, let's make a list of things we could do that would help both of us get past this problem. We could just keep having arguments and stay angry and frustrated with each other. We always list the status quo as a possible solution because that's motivating for change. If the status quo isn't acceptable, people will be more interested in looking at other possible solutions. Timmy might say, no limits, no rules. Mom won't shoot that down because this is just the brainstorming step. Mom might say no screens at all. Timmy might say, what? But Mom says, no, we're just listing now, good ideas, bad ideas. They might list daily maxes. They might say 1 hour off screens earns 1 hour on. They might agree that rules broken means no screens tomorrow. Parent electronic controls, a no screen day, Saturday or Sunday, with other days having no rules except screens can't get in the way of school, chores, sleep, or dinner. This is just a list of possible solutions. We don't vote on them until we get to the E step. Here, 0 stinks, 1 is bad, 2 is okay, 3 is good, 4 is very good, 5 is excellent. On some of these, there's agreement. On some, there's not. Others, there's a little bit of meeting of the minds. And what we do is see, without debate, where is there common ground when we pick the best solutions. Here we've got a 3, meaning good or better, with this one solution, a day off of screens. We've got okay or yellow with 2, meaning okay or better, for a few other possible solutions. And we put red through any solution where there's no better than a 0 or a 1. Now, if one person puts a 1 and the other one puts a 5, that's still not going to be mutual, not going to be durable, so it gets redded out. And then Timmy and Mom will try their solution and see how it goes, with the understanding that there's sometimes a solution that works better than we think it will. Some solutions work worse than we thought, but they have a meeting a week later. It doesn't work perfectly, and that's okay. That's how we learn. They problem solve again. Gradually, the plan gets better. With optimism and practice, their problem solving skills get better too. And we can apply these steps, this collaborative problem solving model, to screen time, to screen content, to alternatives. What are we going to do besides screens? Summer structure. What about the school year ahead? Really, empathy and collaborative problem solving steps can be used for just about anything. So my hope is that this pandemic doesn't go to waste, that these pandemic, screen, and summer planning challenges represent opportunities to teach empathy, to practice collaborative problem solving. And for more about this model, you can see my books or the parentchildjourney.com website for upcoming programs. But I hope you find that this model works well as a starting point to do some talking with your child instead of just talking to them. Thanks very much.
That was fantastic, Dan. And I know, as a practicing pediatrician, as you are, the solutions are always like, okay, you gave me the idea, I know what you want, but how am I going to get through that with my kid? How are we going to make this happen? And I think that focus on here's how we're going to get to an agreement Fantastic. I hope we're going to hear a little bit more about that as the questions come in at the end. However, between now and then, we get to hear from another amazing expert. Dr. Stephen Miles Uzo develops and leads large-scale initiatives to research and integrate cutting-edge science into teaching and learning. These initiatives include building communities of practice and complexity, data-driven science and engineering, and to improve STEM literacy of the public. His background includes over 20 years experience in the research of connected systems and teaching and learning in data-driven STEM, and prior to that, 10 years in video and computer graphics systems engineering. Dr. Uzo's research interests include the coupling of complex human and natural systems, evolution and scaling of complex networks, smart cities, and the impact of big data on communities of need. He holds a terminal degree in network theory and environmental studies from Union Institute and serves on a number of institutional and government advisory boards related to his interests. Having never lived very far from the ocean in New York and California, Dr. Uzo has been a lifelong advocate for marine conservation. Dr. Uzo, thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot, David, and thanks, Pam, and everybody for inviting me to come and talk a little bit about science learning in children, and try to give the attendees of this event a sense as to why it's important for children, particularly young children, to engage with their environment. Jessica mentioned the idea of how children are born scientists. Well, that's because the real definition of science is simply the act of asking questions of nature and seeking evidence in nature to answer those questions, something that's essential for children in order to make sense of their world and how they encounter it, and how everything that they encounter in their world fits together. Intuitively, we know this, and developmental researchers like Alison Gopnik have studied this extensively. Along with this is rethinking how the mind works. We once thought of it as a computer, but it's becoming increasingly evident that not only is the mind not really a computer, but it also is not just in the brain. It turns out that we actually think through our interaction with our environment, whether that interaction includes other people, four bare walls, a mobile phone, a book, television, or a walk in the woods. How we think and what we think about is directly related to what we do. This is called extended cognition. So when we're thinking about what we do with our kids and what kind of environment we provide for them to interact with, particularly now when the variety of things to interact with is limited, it's useful to keep this in mind. Of course, this is really hard because we have to balance our own work life with time with our kids, and we've all been through the tension of how to guide or influence our kids' play as they resist our efforts to steer them away from screens. All the Zoom calls that I've been on with many of my colleagues and the people that I work with have included a toddler on their lap, a dog barking in the background, kids running around. We're all trying to balance this. So now, when we often, the only way we can play, kids can play with their friends is through video calls, multi-user games, and even interactions with their relatives have to be through phones, tablets, or laptop computers. We're kind of stuck thinking about this as almost a default to how we interact outside of our own families or our little quarantine groups, or what they're calling pods now, of people who are quarantined together. But on the other hand, there are lots of opportunities to interact in a variety of ways through the screens when we're stuck inside. Everything from virtually sharing board games that we're playing, sitting around a table, hands-on experimentation, cooking, constructing things together across the web, drawing and singing with each other, even dinner time conversations, but also sharing walks in the woods through phones and portable devices, which is something people don't really think about, and sort of demonstrating the differences between places where people are walking, sometimes even sharing a walk in the woods. So in one place, one relative in one part of the country might be walking in the woods, and our kid might be walking in the woods in another, and drawing attention to things that are different. There are tons of ways to learn by leveraging what we can do with online interactions, in some cases that we can't actually do together in person. But knowing how to start and where to go for resources can be kind of bewildering. So I wanted to give you a couple of resources that can get you started. remembering that these kinds of experiences can always be shared with other friends in quarantine over your devices. And I guess for me, because I've spent a lot of my time and interest in and concern about children's interactions with the outdoors and nature and families spending time in nature, and thinking about how we make sure, in accordance with the public health guidelines, that we find the most important ways to get kids active and curious about nature. And it doesn't have to just be in the woods, in some kind of suburban setting or rural setting, but in urban neighborhoods or backyards or at the beach or the woods. So one resource to get you started is something called Plum Landing. It's a PBS resource. I can put the URL in the chat, but I can also play you a short video clip by sharing my screen. That'll give you a sense of some of these tips that are accessible to parents. I'm going to play this now. Hopefully all of you can hear it. Let me share my screen. This is about 2 minutes long.
Top reasons to get your family outdoors having fun with science. Getting outside with kids is easier than you think. I'm Rue Matt, founder of Outdoor Afro. I help families all over the country get connected to nature. Here are my top 5 reasons to get outside. Number 1, it's fun to explore nature together. Go on a nature walk or fly a kite on a windy day to experience the power of the wind. All these things are science, and they can't be done indoors. Number 2, it helps children develop new skills. Create your own cards to play nature bingo. Instead of numbers, use insects, birds, plants, or rocks. This game helps kids with their matching skills and shows them the many different living things in their own neighborhood. To develop more skills, kids can map the objects to help them with their map reading, or they can use a field guide to identify a bird or insect. Number 3, it helps you connect with your family, even revealing surprises. Your cautious kid may have an adventurous streak when searching out a great spot to find a squirrel, or your spirited kid may surprise you by quietly observing a spider weaving a web. Number 4, it's good for your family's health. It can lower blood pressure and heart rate, improve eyesight and immune system functioning, and cut the risk of obesity. It's also good for your mental health. It can help you relax, reduce anxiety and ADHD symptoms, improve your mood, and increase your focus. Number 5, it's a great way to learn about the world. Outdoor exploration inspires questions, even if you don't know the answers. Notice things and ask questions like, why do you find so many worms on the sidewalk after it rains? Or how do these little bugs make such crazy loud sounds? It can help kids become good observers, notice patterns, and think about cause and effect. For more simple science activities, check out Plum Landing at pbskids.org/plumlanding. There, you'll find app suggestions and printable nature activities your family can do right in your own neighborhood.
So that's just an example. I'm going to put the, in the chat, I will put the URL. And that's just something, that's one of many kinds of resources that website lists a lot of them. We use these resources all the time with kids and with workshops that we do. And to get inspired yourself, I would suggest reading Rachel Carson's Sense of Wonder, which was actually a letter. It was turned into a book about 20 years ago. She is one of the foremost, I guess, for lack of a better term, sort of interdisciplinary teachers of nature. And she has a great way of talking about bringing kids into the woods. So I'm going to put that into there for some inspiration for you as parents to think about how to interact with your kids in the outdoors, and just the way that people think about, experts think about this. And then on the other side of it, when you're stuck indoors, remembering that your kitchen is really a laboratory. And when you prepare food, you're interacting with and experimenting with nature too. All the ingredients come from nature, and your kid can come up with lots of ideas for how to work and do things in the kitchen. You can start with recipes. They can come up with their own recipes. They can experiment with things that aren't really recipes, and just observe and come up with interesting ways to look at everything from physics to nutrition. So here's an example, which I will put up on the screen of it's basically something that's downloadable. So I will share my screen once again and put this up very quickly. This is just a downloadable kitchen activity that you can do with your kids. It's a very simple way to make butter with a jar, but teaches some very important sort of process ideas about how some of the food that they take for granted comes to be. So and these are pretty explicit, and yes, they're sort of prescribed, but they're conducive to lots of questions. You know, why does cream become butter? And looking at the things like, so there are things like, various ways to do variations on those processes, and thinking about what kinds of skills that they acquire and questions they can come up with. So that's another example. I can put the URL for that in there too. And then finally, just I guess the important thing for me is that parents don't feel like they need to have all the answers. And sometimes the best way for kids to learn is for you to ask them questions and them to actually start to think about these kinds of things, because we think about things when we feel like we have to answer a question. And very often those questions result in other questions. And that's a really important way that kids learn about their world, whether they're asking questions of you, their friends, or even themselves when they're doing things by themselves. So that's pretty much all I have to share right now, and I'm happy to talk through the question and answer with any additional ideas. I'll put this one activity up, the URL for that in the chat, and I'm happy to add more to that if the occasion arises. But thank you, David, and thank you, Pam, for giving me the opportunity to talk.
That is super excited, and I just want to go make butter now, as a matter of fact. I love that. I remember doing that as a child. Still the best butter. I mean, you put herbs and stuff in there. I know you're not learning anything, but all right. We are ready for a little bit of question and answer time, and we've got a fair bit of time there for it. Our first question came in multiple times, so I want to give everybody a chance. There's a question: are there particular websites, tools, apps that each of you recommend for sort of healthy or constructive screen time with kids? I know sometimes people are a little reluctant to endorse one app or another, but if you do have any that that you enjoy, you point people toward. I know, Stephen, you just shared a couple of great ones. Jessica, anything that you like to point people to?
Yeah, so I would always add the caveat in saying that parents should check anything out ahead of time themselves first and see if it aligns with their own family values. But I have found in my work that content created by Toca Boca is often really interesting to kids in this audience. It allows a lot of creativity. Same goes for TinyBot, which is another app company that creates a lot of different apps for kids. If your children are a bit older and are maybe looking for more supplemental educational content, the Khan Academy often has a lot of interesting support, I'd say there. Some more fun content in that space. If you haven't played Presidents versus Aliens yet, that's a pretty good one. I'm a fan. I also like Marble Math. Marble Math is a really nice, fun game for kids. I'd also say that GarageBand, this is something that many of your kids might actually be playing with a little bit. It allows them to make music. So you might want to get them headphones so you don't give yourself a headache in the process. But again, it really establishes an opportunity for creativity. In addition, I would say paying attention to the difference between YouTube and YouTube Kids. This is something I find that many people naturally, and I think it's very reasonable, many people don't know this, but YouTube Kids really is a separate space with a cultivated set of videos for kids that are more age appropriate. This is again something you should be mindful of, but it's a separate app altogether. Other things, I was writing down ideas as you guys were talking. I also find that Common Sense Media is a nice resource for parents. This is a website you can go to. And what I like about this resource is that it's not just about apps or not just about games, but you can also find information about television shows and books and be able to sort this by developmental preferences and things like that. So that can be another resource for parents as well. David, you are muted. We knew you were going to do it.
And I was the one who joked about it. I was like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. I did it. Dan, hopefully you're now unmuted. I see that you are actually. Do you have any that you want to point people to?
Hard to add to their good list.
All right, fantastic. And I know that there are, so in terms of positive parenting, I think you were really focusing on sort of positive parenting. If you look up 3P or P3 or positive parenting, there are some good resources out there, and I love it because it gets you out of a fight. And when we look at things that cause fights, my wife is a pediatric psychiatric provider now. She's a pediatric PA, and she gets kids who are in crisis because parents set limits on their screen use, and she's had kids threaten suicide because they felt like the thing that connects them to the world has been cut off. And finding a way to work together with your child rather than butt heads, I think, is so important. So hopefully we'll find some of those resources for folks. People will find them on their own.
Just on that front, my favorite book is much of my material comes from Ross Green's model from The Explosive Child. Martin Seligman wrote Learned Optimism and The Optimistic Child to help kids frame problems in specific solvable terms. And those are two seminal books I'd point people to for positive parenting. Yeah.
Fantastic, fantastic. I think some of our readers are really going to want to geek out on this subject. So go deep, people, go deep. It's great. These are your kids. Our next question that's come up a couple of times is well, it's really kind of a combination of two questions. I'm going to try and lump them rather than split them, but really the lump is connectivity, right? We're in a state where we're asking people not to connect in person so much, to keep their groups small, to stay far away from people, to not hug, to not play a board game over a table together, to not eat in a restaurant together. Many of us are still trying to take precautions like that. And as a practicing pediatrician, I encourage you to continue to stick with that. But then on the flip side, children learn and develop so much because of their interactions with the people around them. So the real gist of this question for everybody is, if you're cutting off or limiting some of these physical, personal interactions, what are we going to replace them with? And since we're talking about electronic communications, I'd love to invite everybody to talk about the sort of ideas that they have for supplementing the normal in-person interactions that kids have and learn from with online interactions. I'll just keep going in order. Jessica?
I think this is a great question. It's funny, I thought you were going to go the other direction and say, can you come up with non-digital activities, actually? And so I'm actually going to throw that back and actually do a non-digital first that I have been seeing that's been really interesting. And I live here in the Netherlands, for those that don't know. One of the things I've seen that started happening is that kids are parents have been encouraging kids to write letters to each other, their friends to write letters, and actually letters with paper and crayons and things I haven't seen in some time. And that's been very interesting. They've also been practicing writing messages to each other on chalkboard streets and things like that with school board chalk. And I think that these are really unique ideas that parents are already sensing ways to communicate. In addition to that, I actually think there's a lot of digital ways to do this. There's a lot of games out there if you have access to digital technology in your home. Not all families do, but if you do, there's a lot of digital platforms that allow co-play, right? So you can play with one person on a phone and one on their computer. Friends can set this up. You can set this up with parents where you say, okay, let's have a digital hour with our kids playing. Pictionary was what I saw last week. Kids were playing digital Pictionary together, and they could use a website where they could stream music together. So they were listening to music together while playing Pictionary together online. So again, this also matters what sort of resources you have at your disposal, but there's actually a lot of watch now together, listen now together websites that are freely available that can be a way to sort of foster a connection amongst your kids, but you have to probably help set them up at first a little bit. So it does require a little bit of a digital practice on all of us, I think.
That's awesome.
Yeah, what do you think? Or Steve?
I'm unmuted now. So, you know, one of the things, and watching my partner and interact with her granddaughter lives I'm in Woods Hole right now. Her granddaughter lives in San Diego, and they do these very long activities together, one of which is drawing. So they'll get on each end of the video conference, it's FaceTime or something, I forget exactly, or Zoom. They get out their crayons, and they get out their pencils and paper, and they actually draw together for hours. And little Charlotte loves this. She's 6 years old right now, but there are lots of more sophisticated kinds of things to share over video conferencing. I think I mentioned before going for walks in the woods. So we actually have gone for walks in the woods and shared it with my partner's son's family, which is in San Diego. And, you know, so we're here in sort of the Northeast, and they're in
We may have a freeze there.
I think we have a freeze. Well, while Stephen is thinking
sharing
of this,
dinner, we've actually had the iPad sitting there at a chair at the dinner table while we're all eating dinner and having a dinner time conversation. And you know, so I mean, thinking of inventive ways to take this video conferencing and move it into areas where you're not just a talking head like us, but more having it, you're interacting and doing the kinds of things you normally do with people. And it's surprising how much engagement you can get out of that.
I love that. Did you have anything to add down there?
Yeah, you know, my first reaction was Jessica's. What can we do off screens more? And I wouldn't give up on kids spending time together outdoors. It does help that we're heading into summer. I'm more worried when we get into the really bad weather. But I know one patient of mine in their neighborhood, they have set up distance soccer playing. Where the whole neighborhood up and down the street, no hands, okay? So just kicking the ball back and forth across the street. There's one parent out there to make sure there are no cars coming, but they are playing soccer up and down the street. It involves the whole block. There are other families that are organizing bike rides where you can safely scooter, bike ride, rollerblade, keeping distance. So I hope that people are more creative about getting outdoors and keeping some distance. And that as a pediatrician, a medical guy, background wise, is considered very, very low risk. There's some families who are enlarging their nuclear family bubble, and other families that are keeping similar quarantine rules are buddying up with other families or two. You know, if this is going to go on for a year at least, there's no way that we can have total shutdown. The price paid for kids' social development has to be weighed against the infectious disease concern. So there's going to be some risk weighing that goes on here that I think is important. Online, to do socially connecting instead of self-absorbed activities, playing Minecraft together is better than playing it by yourself, and having dance parties together online, and on and on. So I think we want to have a variety of things on the menu for kids to choose from.
I love that. And I will add that I have a large blended family. We've got 5 kids between us, and it's very hard, even in normal times, for us all to get together around a board game. So instead, we can put up on the TV something like Kahoot or Jackbox. And in fact, when we're not even in the same place, we can still sort of have a Zoom game, and that gets us together. I want to flip this question on its head a little bit and hit one of the next questions. And I think everybody sort of started down this road as well, but we might want to elaborate on it and take it to some new places. We've been talking about what you can do if you have access to devices and you have access to internet. The next question is, what if that access is limited? What about parents in low resource settings, parents who don't have a lot of access to devices or to high-speed internet? What do we recommend for them? Are there ways that they can find access to do some things, or alternately, are there things that they just should be doing? Like, is it just better? I mean, honestly, in some ways, it may be easier to say, hey, you know, we can't spend all of our time online. We're going to have to do some stuff. I'm going to open that up and sit back.
David, I would just quickly suggest that we not forget that there are such things as libraries. And I know most libraries are doing things where you order the books beforehand and you have to go there and pick them up, and you have to be careful about exposure and all these things. But libraries are still free, and with the proper health precautions, there are lots of resources there that can help parents figure out how to interact with their kids in ways that they might not be thinking about. It might be recipe books. Let's get some recipe books and learn to cook together. It might be resources about how to identify things in nature. There's lots of help out there in libraries. And even though libraries are not a public space at this point, there's lots of resources that we can access through books. Sometimes going through our own bookshelves, we find books that we bought a while ago and just sort of let collect dust because we're now turned our attention towards everything that's being online. So that's my suggestion.
Yeah, I think there are many activities that can be converted, like my example of the physical or social distancing soccer can be converted to make them safe. There are ways to play baseball that can be safe, even though the ball is shared. That would be considered a relatively low risk surface that kids could share with one another with some screening for infection, etc. There can be track and field events, tennis events, street hockey. But I'm with Steve about getting back to nature. One of my favorite books is Last Child in the Woods. And there are 100 suggestions at the back end of that for getting kids outdoors. And these things can be done with some spacing between. So I hope that in the summer, we really get unplugged and don't look entirely to screens for social connection. It's not just people who don't have access to devices, but for all of us.
Yeah, Dan, as you and I are both practicing pediatricians, and I just want to reiterate, there's zero reason to be scared to go outside. Outside is really about the safest place you can be right now. There's very little record of outside transmission. Shared surfaces like balls or frisbees or baseball bats seem to be pretty darn low risk, although keeping some hand sanitizer around or encouraging hand washing is still a really good idea. That sinks into a question we have about existing in a small space with a large family. Man, I know that feeling. I think the first and obvious thing is see how much time you can get out of that space. But second of all, when you are trapped, if it's, raining or it doesn't feel safe outside or it's too hot or too cold, then digital environments can help people get a little bit of room from each other, even when they're crammed together. You stick your earpiece in and you put your device up to your face and you're kind of alone in a group, I would add. I want to hear everybody's take on a question that comes up a lot. And I think I take some responsibility as the former chair of the American Academy of Pediatrics Council on Communications and Media for people being very worried about this, because I think to some extent we drove this. There is still a sense that there is like a number of hours that are too many on screen, or is it okay to learn a thing? What if my son's taking guitar lessons? And so is it okay to get guitar lessons or piano lessons or drawing lessons online? Is that too much screen time? In my view, it always comes back to what are you doing with it? Not how many hours is it? But I'd like to give everybody else a chance to talk about the screen time concerns. Is this okay? Is there a limit to the time, etc.? So let me throw that out there. Maybe we'll start with Jessica. You can't tell I'm looking at you, but
No,
that's where you are.
but that's where it is.
In my world, you're right. You're right there. Eye contact.
Got the eye contact. I'm with you. Well, I think in my presentation, I probably alluded to my response on this, is that I really don't want to set a number of hours. I have not seen recent data that would suggest that that's a very helpful heuristic for us nowadays. I know it's something we use, but I really do think it's a quality argument, and quality I also think is often defined by the child. I know some families where a bit longer media is very good for their particular child because it works on calming them down so they can perhaps focus on caregiving another child that may need it. Then I know the exact reverse situation where a parent will say, if I even let her watch 5 minutes of XYZ show, it's a nightmare. And then she says, I have to turn it off. And I say, well, that's perfectly okay then. As a parent, you often have a sense of how your children are responding to media, and you quickly know which ones are the ones that don't bother you, that fit in your values, or ones that are just sort of have some a reaction that is not acceptable in your own household. So I think that's probably what I do. I look to the different amount, I look to the quality. Having said that, I think all of us, I was saying before the call today, I think I'm on my 12th hour of Zooming today for work and then doing this. And I think all of us do feel the physical effects of being with digital technology too, not just the physical effects on our body, our tired eyes. Perhaps for me, it's my sore back from sitting here for so long. And kids too, right? So one of the things to be mindful of is a balance with anything else. And so being mindful of how long your kids have been sitting inside for. If it's a rainy day, maybe it was more useful than a day where it was beautiful and safe for them to go outside. So with anything else, I think variety is key, and I would think quality over quantity without giving an estimate.
Yeah, I would make a agree 100% with Jessica and David that we shouldn't be setting hours. But I think there's a big difference between computer activities or screen activities that are socially connecting versus ones that are socially isolating. I think there's a big difference between screen activities that are growth activities that expand the mind, where you learn about new things, and activities that are repetitious and really not growing, just doing the same darn thing over and over. There's a big difference between activities that last hour after hour after hour after hour, and screen activities that last for a period of time. There's a beginning, middle, and an end, and then you do something else, and then you return to it. And there's a big difference between so-called high dopamine activities, immediate gratification, real buzz, adrenaline rush kind of stuff. Those tend to have more addiction potential than screen activities where gratification is more delayed. So this idea of not saturating those dopamine receptors over and over and over again and create a craving state with true withdrawal symptoms. Screen addiction has a physiologic basis. So the type of activity in all these different ways matters tremendously.
I'd just like to add to what Dan said that so one of the things that I like to think about, and having raised a daughter, thinking about that a lot, is, you know, how do we model the behavior we want them to enact? And you know, if we're on our phones all the time and we're not attending to them and we're not paying attention to them because of our own use of media, or if we're binge watching Twilight Zone all day, or if, you know, whatever the activity is, we're probably not modeling the behavior that we expect from them. And come on, kids know that you're being disingenuous about it. They know that you know, they know when you're doing your do what I say, not what I do kind of thing. So it's important that we're honest with ourselves about what we really want from our kids and how we want to model the behavior that we want from them. And I know, though, there are lots of ways that kids triangulate that, and it doesn't always have the kind of impact or that we think it's going to have. But kids are always watching. In my experience, they know what you're doing. They're paying a lot more attention to you than you think they are. So I think it's important just to be conscious of that, and think about that when we're trying to decide, you know, should they be spending more or less time, and also spending time with them. When my daughter was really small, my wife at the time and we argued a lot about how much time she should spend watching television. And my compromise was I would sit there when she was really little with her in my lap. We would watch some very specific shows together, and we would talk about them and what she was thinking about them when she was watching them. So, I mean, there are ways to sort of think about how we interact with media, as well as how much.
I'm thinking David's muted again.
You know, I'm using the space bar, but I was in the chat box. And so instead of unmuting, it just created a long space. And it's cute. Go ahead, Jessica.
I was going to add to what Dan said. One of the things that I have found actually very valuable in this debate a little bit is Dan mentioned this notion of not having a stop, right? Things keep going. And what we've seen in some research is that, 15 years ago, most of our media had a beginning, middle, and an end. We would go to the movie, we would watch the movie, it would end, we would leave. We would pick up a newspaper, we would read the paper and put it away. Same with a book or a magazine. Where suddenly we're in a space now where our media doesn't always end. Our videos that we're watching online keep going, right? There's an autoplay feature. Netflix kindly lets us binge watch all day long. And when we're on any of our social media spaces, it's very easy to get sucked into the rabbit hole of whatever social platform you're on, because our news feed also doesn't end. As humans, what we know is we actually respond very well when we have a stop. That red light actually makes us stop and makes us think for a second and be a little bit aware. That's incredibly important for kids, because they're still trying to figure out how to self-regulate their behavior. So without having that stop, they can really keep going in an impressive way. So one thing that can be really useful tip is whatever your children are playing or using with, usually the autoplay feature can be turned off. So often the default is that autoplay is on, but if you go right to settings in almost every space I've seen, autoplay can be turned off. And it's a simple thing you could do at the beginning of downloading or using. And then there's a bit of a conversation at the end of this video or at the end of this game, at the end of that's when we're going to stop in that conversation, perhaps using some of Dan's tips from earlier. But that tends to work really well if you kind of build in the red light that kids often need.
Yeah, I remember an old movie, The Never Ending Story, except ironically it ended. And now, at night when we're going to bed and I'm scrolling social media before bedtime, I joke with my wife, I'm like, wait, I'm almost to the end of Pinterest, but it just keeps going, right? I love building in those rests. I'll add from the American Academy of Pediatrics standpoint, the one way we visualize this is to start with everything else that you want to see happen during the day. And if you go to the to healthychildren.org, the family media use plan, you can actually do that graphically. You say, okay, we need 15 minutes for breakfast. We said you were going to read for an hour a day. You said you wanted to draw. You're going to play soccer for 30 minutes. You got 2 hours of schoolwork. We're going to have dinner together as a family. You're going to bed at 9. Oh, here's what's left. So instead of starting with, oh, 2 hours of screen time is too much, or 5 hours is great, you're like, well, this is everything else you said you wanted to do. And I guess we can slot some screen time in here when you're not doing those other things. Or some of those things might be very screen oriented. My 15-year-old is bored out of his skull right now. He's like, Dad, I want to learn Python. I'm gonna learn a programming language. Well, that you have to do that on screen. There's no little workbooks you can get. I'm sure there are somewhere, but it helps to do it online. And that's a positive thing there. Let's see, we have, oh, this is a great question. I think it's probably going to kick to Dan to begin with. Kids at different ages, how do you have different rules for different ages? Like, your brother's 5 and you're 2, and I know he's playing his game right now, but I need you to be doing something more active. So great question.
Yeah, this idea of is fair equal comes up all the time. And I think a kid who's old enough to ask about fairness and equality is old enough to get a sophisticated answer. And we teach kids that equal is unfair. And I very much like a cartoon that has 3 kids of different heights. You know the one, Jessica. Yep. 3 kids of different heights trying to look over a fence to watch a baseball game. And one kid is standing on the ground and is tall enough to see over the fence just fine. Another kid is medium height and can't see over the fence. And another kid is just really, really short. And if you put them all on equal sized boxes, it doesn't really change things. You need a no box for the tall kid, a medium-sized box for the medium-sized kid, and a very tall box for the short kid. So treating them equally would not be fair. Giving them each a box that does the job, different size boxes for different size kids. And so at different ages, we have different rules. There are different needs. In our family, each of you is treated as an individual. And that's a principle we're going to live and die by. So I don't think parents need to get defensive about just stating that and doing what's right for each child. Not so much depending on age, perhaps, but on the child's individual neurodevelopmental profile and behavioral style factors in just as much as age, at least. So,
Stephen, I see you leaning forward. Did you have? You look like you might have a thought there. Or not? Well, I did it again.
I would add that one thing I think you can also capitalize on is actually with kids is often scaffolding a little bit. So often if you have, it depends on the age of your kids and where they are and how big of a gap it is. But for example, oftentimes if you have maybe a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old, the 7-year-old can help show the 4-year-old how to make mom's lunch that day. Maybe you can get, if you're working at home, maybe you can convince those kids to make you lunch one day or something like that. So sometimes when they actually are helping each other, this sort of scaffolding or sort of working together can be a unique way to kind of merge these activities. So thinking of outside activities where the older one can help the younger one and teach a bit often can be very empowering for your older one, and the younger one gets that like, oh, I'm getting help from my big brother who normally ignores me.
I tell you, when people say, how do you deal with 5 kids? Especially when they were younger, that's the answer. You get the older ones, you're like, get your sister over here and keep her out of the street and, I don't know, color with her.
Well, I think I'm speaking from personal experience because I'm the oldest of 6 and this is what we did most of my life.
It's your job, right?
It was my job, yeah.
Stephen, I saw you leaning forward a second ago. You might have something to add there.
Well, having had only one daughter, I don't know how much I could offer in terms of how I would treat if I had more than that, but I'm the middle child of 6, and I was the one that sort of watched the older kids, like dealing with the younger kids. I had to care for 3 younger daughters who are actually much younger than I was. So I guess by some proxy measure, maybe I have a little bit of experience that way. And I guess what I've always found is that their personalities differ so greatly that the way that we sort of give them boundaries differs. You know, one of my sisters, I mean, I was 12 years old when I was caring for 3 younger sisters. One of them, it's like they needed something physical. And I remember one time having to dump a bowl of cereal over my sister's head to get her to stop acting out, because she was taking away from my ability to care for one that was like I had to change the diaper of, things like that, you know, the multitasking problem. But just, you know, so not only developmentally, but also sort of personality wise, some kids are like, you know, they're gonna sit and do things themselves. They don't want people to give them a hard time. Let me just read this book and don't bother me. And then other kids are like constantly like, you know, in need of something or doing something to get your attention. And again, by proxy, because this is based on my sisters, not my kids, to take that with a little bit of a grain of salt.
Right. So not just age, but really temperament, personality. There's so many differences. We've got just about a minute and a half left, but I did want to hit one other question, which is very, very medical, which is what can we say about the medical effects of screen time? The Academy's greatest concerns are sleep. That's number one. This blue enriched light that comes from our screens can interfere with sleep, and bad sleep interferes with academics. It interferes with self-regulatory behavior. It can even contribute to obesity. So if there's one time not to have screens, I would say it's bedtime, ideally for an hour before bed. We think somewhat about activity displacement. Kids who are just watching passive programming, there is a strong correlation with obesity there, less so with gaming or more interactive programming. You can't really say that as well. But definitely, you know, get your kid up to move around. I can't do this without getting up and stretching around and shaking out. Make sure that your kids do too. There are some concerns about vitamin D. Now, we'd like all children to be supplemented with vitamin D every day, but going outside is a good way to get it as long as you're also avoiding sunburn. And so, you know, we do want to be outside some. Myopia is an interesting question because close work has been associated with nearsightedness, but then we don't tell kids not to read, which would have the same risk for myopia. So that's a tough one, but you do want to give them periods of looking far away, which is a lot easier to do outside. We got about 5 minutes left at this point, and so I want to hand this back to Pamela Hurst Della Pietra, our host, and let her wrap this up for us.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming and for asking such insightful questions. And thank you, David, Jessica, Dan, and Steve for a remarkable workshop with so many great ideas for families to implement. The conversation will continue on Monday, this coming Monday, when Dr. Robert Bilder, director of the Tenenbaum Center for the Biology of Creativity at UCLA, will lead a fascinating workshop about teens and screens this summer. And on the panel, you can see Richard Louv, author of The Last Child in the Woods that Dan mentioned is one of his favorite books. Following Monday's workshop, starting on June 17th, we will hold a workshop every week throughout the summer, each addressing a different topic related to digital media and child development. So keep an eye on our website, which is www.childrenscreens.com for more information. We hope that you'll join us on Monday, and please share the YouTube video you'll receive of today's workshop with your fellow parents, teachers, clinicians, researchers, and friends. I'm sure they'll really appreciate it. When you leave the workshop, you'll see a link to a short survey. Please click on the link and let us know what you thought of the workshop. Thanks again, and everyone be safe and well.